Space exploration is a Factorio mod that adds a huge amount of new content. It's technically still in development, but already it feels like a complete game experience. I just spent 225 hours completing it, which tells you something. This video will be a combination review/base tour. There are going to be spoilers, but I'll leave the main ones to the end and let you know before we get there. The first challenge is launching a satellite rocket with a slightly modified tech tree. None of it remains in this base, but I appreciated the early game additions to use burner equipment for longer than usual, and the additional intermediary parts needed for many items, such as different kinds of engines. To get there, I used a simple bus with trains to bring in resources. This was my first time using the logistic train network mod, another mod that I also used, and it took me a while to get comfortable with it. Even now, I still have a bit of trouble diagnosing certain throughput issues. Given the expanded recipes, it takes longer than usual to get that rocket launched, which meant some extra protection from the locals. I was pretty happy with this wall setup that used LTN to restock essential items. After launching a rocket, then the real game starts. You need to get up into orbit, which requires life support equipment, a cargo rocket, and a way to get back. All research from rocket science onward can only be processed in space, so you need to design a system to constantly launch rockets containing the items you need. Here is my first attempt that initially just sent science packs, but eventually turned into a catch-all logistics rocket. It's not well designed and breaks all the time. I have better solutions for other destinations, but never went back to fix the original. For simple resources, you can use delivery cannons, which are mostly simpler but don't have a lot of throughput. To build rocket science, you'll need Vulcanite, one of the 10 new resources that can only be found on other planets and moons, which you discover by launching satellite rockets. My Vulcanite planet had no water, and sending barrels of it by delivery cannon wasn't a huge amount of fun. In hindsight, I probably should have tried to find a source of ice or cryonite first. I tried setting up core mining, but it required 50 megawatts of power, which I didn't have a way of delivering at the time. I never came back to core mining, so it's an area of the game I haven't explored. Luckily, my Vulcanite planet also had plenty of holmium, another new resource, and some decent copper patches, which could supplement my dwindling reserves on the home planet. I repeated the process on other planets for other resources: cryonite, iridium, vital melange, and beryllium. The last one required dealing with a persistent biter problem, which was most annoying until I beelined to plague rocket tech to irradiate the entire world. Progress isn't pretty. You can notice here some new minimal beacon production designs. Space exploration adds a requirement that buildings can only be affected by a single beacon. I really like this. I never enjoyed multiple beacon builds, and I found this constraint much more interesting. The only non-specialist resource planet I colonized was a dedicated oil planet, which then also later provided iron, as I pretty much ran out of both on my home planet. In orbit, I started building out a 4-pronged minibus, one for each type of astronomic, material, energy, and biological science packs. I really enjoyed the new buildings and recipes here, and thematically it all works really well. I feel like this is an underappreciated aspect of this mod. How well it works narratively and how pretty it is. We've got telescopes and dishes scanning the skies, mechanical facilities smashing trains together and blowing things up to measure forces, labs growing stuff, and large power particle colliders. It was a treat discovering each new research step. For some mid-tier sciences, you need to start launching research rockets from different regions, such as an asteroid field or near the surface of the sun. I built tiny outposts for these and collected them with spaceships, another new addition from the mod. These spaceships were another completely new design challenge. You need to ensure they're fueled, control their route with a circuit network, which I made a tutorial about, link in the description, power them, protect them from destructive asteroids while flying, and all within limited space. How spaceships work changed halfway through my playthrough. Now you can send signals through docking clamps, which makes things quite a bit nicer, but I didn't upgrade any of my old ships. While I enjoyed the initial challenge of building spaceships, I found them brittle and annoying as my playthrough progressed. There's a race condition where sometimes they will engage after launch but the engines won't turn on, leaving them sitting around not going anywhere. Loading and unloading containers on them also never felt right to me, using half an underground belt, and then not having many options with 1x1 containers. The developer does recommend using a mod that adds larger containers, which I probably should have tried. I do think I was working against the game a little bit here though, at least until the late game. I probably should have used cargo rockets a lot more than I did. Probably my biggest issues with Spaceships though was transit time. Well, I did appreciate the extra constraint this provided, which required a bit more planning for visits and thought around logistics. It was multiple minutes with early tech to visit bases and new locations, and even with antimatter engines, it was still a 25-minute one-way trip to the only asteroid field I had with Naquium. So any issues, of which there was always going to be plenty, took ages to both fix and then see if the fix worked. I suspect this constraint would have had the same effect with less frustration if travel times were halved or even more. Speaking of new base planning, the ability to load up a container based on the needs of a blueprint would be a huge quality of life improvement. Deep Space Science had some new challenges again. This is the thing that impressed me the most about this mod. It continually delivered new and interesting challenges all the way through the mid and late game. That said, Deep Space Science was a bit of a grind and caused me to abandon the run for a number of months. First problem was just slow mining, though once I did psych myself up to build a space railway, I did actually enjoy that part of it. Second issue is that Naquium has such a small stack size and comes from so far away that I wasn't really motivated to increase throughput. I was using a cargo rocket, which required dedicated Vulcanite production facilities to fuel. It took 4 rockets full of Vulcanite to fuel a return journey. But 1 rocket full of Naquium doesn't really get you that much. I switched to using a hauler ship, but with a 50-minute round trip time, it still wasn't ideal. Eventually, I blueprinted 6 copies of my hauler ship, which I needed to remember to check for stalling due to the race condition I mentioned earlier. I ended up losing one I forgot to check that ran out of power 20 minutes out, and I left stranded. In hindsight, I suspect the game wanted me to build fewer bigger spaceships. With better container options for ships like I previously mentioned, I may have done this, though at this point in the run I was feeling pretty done and I wasn't feeling engaged by the challenge. See also the previous point about how long the travel times were. Now we're getting into the late game, so spoilers incoming. I really loved arco spheres aesthetically, but in practice they weren't that fun for me. Because of all the different recipes, any circuitry needs to be replicated 8 times by hand. Debugging is tedious. My initial solution to feed transformations to keep all spheres at an average level should have worked, but I only discovered the stupid wiring error I made when deconstructing it for version 2. Version 2 was basically the same approach, trying to keep them all balanced, but based on a slightly different method I saw mentioned online of calculating the expected difference post-processing. This too appeared to work, and then didn't, until I discovered a bug in how it was handling spheres with quantity of 0, fixed that up, replicated the solution 8 times, and then again it appeared to work, but only when no other recipes were using spheres, so I had to disable all other non-balancing related recipes when one sphere was becoming too dominant, and that final solution appeared stable after many hours. Ultimately, it was a fun programming problem, but made unfun by a tedious development environment. I do like the constraint of using the signal system. I wonder if things like a function combinator or basic scripting would keep the essence of the problem while making it feel more ergonomic. And then finally we have the Nexus. This was a grind, mostly because mentally I was not prepared for it. I thought I was done, but it turns out I was not done. I was very much not done. The Nexus requires 6 gigawatts, which is just a crazy amount of power to shove on a spaceship. My first design ran into fluid throughput issues, which are my least favorite bottlenecks to fix, particularly in confined spaces. Then I needed to research 2 more levels of ship integrity, which took many hours of fixing other production-related shortages, and then it's still a really tight fit to get all the engines in, and then I didn't have enough defense and needed to rebuild, plus research extra laser damage, plus building and adding some Naquium accumulators to deal with power spikes, because for some reason my 6.7 gigawatt design only ever got to just over 6, and then finally, probably 10 hours after I thought I was done. Despite some of my criticisms, overall this was an extremely rewarding experience. I think it's the best Factorio experience I've had, and I highly recommend it. It's also still being worked on. The developer has a Patreon and there is an active Discord, so it's just going to keep getting better. If you've played this mod or are now thinking about it, let me know in the comments.